With that, County Executive, welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I was going to say good morning, but I said that wouldn't be right. Good afternoon. It's good to be here. I'm used to walking around a little bit, but I think in deference, I think it's Wisconsin I, right? To keep your mic here so I'm not going away from where the recording is at, I'll try and stand behind a podium for a little bit here. But as Steve mentioned, and I want to thank MMAC every time that either we've asked or they've asked, but oftentimes we'll ask to speak to the board, to speak to groups like this. It gives us a great opportunity to really to dialogue, and you're right about it. It's not just talking. I always hate it when politicians or other business leaders just talk at an audience, but we really want to have a dialogue. So I'm going to spend a few minutes at the beginning just giving you a little bit of an overview, and then really want to dialogue in terms of your questions, not only about our budget proposal, but where maybe you see things in this community going, things we should be doing better, other ways we can interact with your businesses, with your organizations, and the like. For us, this budget, really, there were 5 key objectives that we put in place as we prepared this budget, and ultimately as I presented it to the full county board about 2 weeks ago. Budget-wise, just so you know, the process is in front of the county board's Finance and Audit Committee, and they'll have until about the first week of November when they're done in committee, and then that second week in November they vote on it. The full board does, and then by the Wednesday, the week thereafter, I have that period of time to issue any line item vetoes. Unlike the president, but like the governor, I have a line item veto, so I can strike things out. I can issue 1 or 100 or anywhere in between. And historically, I think we've issued more line item vetoes, God bless you, than any county executive has before. Probably more than all 4 elected ones combined before that. But having been in state government with people like my friend Jeff Stone, who's here from the state assembly as well, we know just how important it is to use that veto and to use it to protect the taxpayer's interest. But in terms of our 5 criteria, the 5 objectives we had going in this budget, the first one was pretty simple. It's one I've said before. In fact, I often say I sound like a broken record, except my 2 high school sons tell me nobody knows what a record is anymore. So I sound like a mixed-up iPod or a scratch CD. But it's making it affordable to live and work in Milwaukee County. That was first and foremost our objective. Second one was to make this, really to make it help create an environment, not to create the jobs themselves, but to create an environment where it was easier for all of you in the private sector to create more jobs here in Milwaukee County. The third component was to protect the core quality of life things, and I'll break that down in just a minute, that we expect here in Milwaukee County and Milwaukee County government's role in that. The fourth and the fifth component really go hand in hand, but the fourth one specifically was to create a better balance between public and private sector benefits, particularly wages and benefits. And then the fifth component was to expound on that and to really put in place a series of reforms that make county government long-term financially, fiscally sustainable. And really the latter part, you probably read in Sunday's Journal Sentinel a little bit about the Public Policy Forum's report about the challenges that the county faces and will continue to face depending on what happens in this budget. That's really what we're getting at on this budget. It's something we worked with the forum and other leaders on, and I'll touch that at the tail end here as well. But to go through each of those just quickly, those 5 points. When it comes to making it affordable to live and to work here in Milwaukee County, obviously one of the biggest roles that government can play in that is in terms of the tax burden. There's obviously many ways that affect your bottom line when it comes to business, but one of the most direct that we in government can be involved in, good or bad, is the tax burden. And so, well, I've done this in the past. In fact, this is the 8th straight budget I've done without raising the property tax levy from the previous year. This year, I think, was particularly important. Not only for employers, when you think about how many employers, and many of you yourselves with your own companies are facing this challenge of being at a point where because of the economy, both locally and globally as well, you're looking at the potential or already have in terms of laying off employees and other challenges there. The last thing we wanted to do is add more costs, which would in turn lay more people off or put more of a burden on our employers. In the same vein, at a time when we have record levels, not only in Milwaukee County, but really throughout this region and across the state, record levels of foreclosure, We have in the Eastern District federal court bankruptcy at an incredible record high in terms of individuals filing bankruptcy. The last thing we want to do is make it more difficult for people to stay in their homes, to pay their bills, to do all those things. So this budget does not have a property tax levy, not just the rate. A lot of times politicians talk about the rate, and the levy goes up, which means your assessment, depending on how it's affected, will see your property tax bill go up. In our case, the proposal we gave to the county board does not raise the levy from the previous year, and that's very important. On top of that, unlike the talk that others in county government and outside of government have talked about, is there is no increase or new expansion of the sales tax built into this budget, and there's no wheel tax, which has been talked about, which of course those who live in the city or have businesses in the city of Milwaukee know has been enacted in the past. So this budget has no tax increase, period. And how do we get there? Well, without going through every essence of that, probably the most important thing, and in a second I'm going to talk about our accelerated building program, but if you set that aside, the overall spending authority in this budget goes down by about 0.6%. It's not a lot, but out of a $1.4 billion budget, reducing your spending authority by anything, let alone 0.6%, does have a real impact. And so that's what we did in this budget. We had to set priorities. We're going to talk about those priorities as we go through this overview. And then we said for the rest, there's a difference between wants and needs. The things we need, we funded. The things we wanted, but maybe didn't know that we absolutely needed, we kind of set aside and had to make judgments on. The second category goes to economic development, making sure that we had really helped build an environment where it was better and easier to create and retain jobs here in Milwaukee County. And some of the things we did to help enhance that. In this budget, we create a new Office of Business Development of the County Executive's Office. It's really to try and work with groups like the M7, MMAC, the Greater Milwaukee Committee, local chambers, and some of the suburban municipalities throughout Milwaukee County to work with all these other elements, visit Milwaukee as well, saying that at this point, when we face the kind of challenges that we do with the economy, we need more boots on the ground. We need more people working together. This was our way of taking not only staff, but also taking some of the dollars that would be contracted for and tying that in directly to the M7 to make an additional partnership and commitment with the Milwaukee 7, which of course addresses all 7 counties here in the southeastern part of Milwaukee, or of Wisconsin. That was critically important for us, and again, those are the sorts of things where it will help us draw off of leads for the M7 and other components, specifically here in Milwaukee County. All the other 6 counties have had in the past and still have some sort of an economic development component where it's an economic development corporation or others out there. Milwaukee County, because it's fully incorporated in terms of every piece of land as a village or a city, has not in the past, and really the county's role prior to my coming here and really for the last several years was they called it economic and community development, but it was really land sales and the administration of block grant funds for all but 3 of the communities here in Milwaukee County. That's really not economic development. That's taking land sales, which what we did in the past is put it in the facilities where it belongs. In this case, we don't resurrect that. We actually create something new and bold and direct. In a bigger sense, though, beyond that, what we really do, I think, to truly stimulate the local economy is through our accelerated building program. What we did is through something that was made available in the federal legislation. It's called Build America bonds. And through the low interest that entities like Milwaukee County can get through Build America bonds, we can actually take projects that we have a 5-year plan for our capital budget. We took projects that would have already been in our building program for 2010, 2011, and 2012. And we accelerated those projects all to be done by the end of 2010. So you take 3 years worth of projects, which is over 100 projects, you put them all into starting now through the end of next year, so a little bit more than a year's worth of time, but really at a time when we critically need more jobs. And our formula estimates that there'll be approximately 1,000 jobs associated to those 100-plus projects. Instead of spreading that over the next 3 years, we do it all at one time. So first and foremost, it has a benefit of pushing more work for construction, for engineering, for architecture, all firms that many of you know are greatly challenged in this current economy and probably will be for the next year and a half at a minimum. and we push that aggressively up into the forefront, accelerate that, and make it happen right away. Now, on top of that, it's also, you might sound like, well, wait a minute, you got a budget challenge, you face this big gap, $78 million you had to begin with, you had to balance this, you're making other cuts and adjustments elsewhere. How do you justify putting almost $400 million worth of new building out there when you add in the airport as well as the capital budget? Well, the benefit of that is because of these bonds and because these are projects that were already queued up over the next 3 years. It's not a matter of creating new work. This is work we've already had plans. It's not like some of the projects you heard about at the federal level where they just started making things up. In our case, we have to do this work. This is work that we already did in a long-term plan. But by using these Build America bonds, we get a much lower interest rate than traditional financing for bonds. And so we save up to $3 million over the life of the bond issue. So we save money while we help push up front more jobs. And then the final part about it is as long as the county board, this is the big if, but if they go along with the proposal as we presented it, we'll do all that, and if we have the discipline to follow it through 2012, we'll actually have outstanding debt in 2012 that is lower, 28% lower in that year than it was when I first came into office in 2002. It's a pretty good deal. I mean, you think about it, you're creating more jobs at a time when you need them, you're saving money on interest, and in the end, if you hang firm through the discipline of doing the plan the way we proposed it, you actually lower your debt by almost 30% from where it was when we started in 2002. That, to us, is thinking smart, thinking wise, using our financial tools, but doing it in a way that doesn't put us further in the debt or cost us more money. It does just the opposite. Third component is protecting, the quality of life. It's what good is it if you hold the line of taxes, you push for more economic development, and then you have nothing left that you like in terms of quality of life. And I would argue that in this budget, we not only maintain, but in many ways improve key components of our quality of life assets here. Everything from public safety, unlike some of the challenges that we saw the rallies about on Sunday for fire and police protection in the city, we maintained support for our sheriff's department, actually added additional assets and equipment for the sheriff. The sheriff is very happy with this budget. We maintained, as a lot of our municipal leaders know, our commitment to the EMS system, one of the best in the country, right here in Milwaukee County. Even in a difficult budget, we maintained that full commitment, both for the oversight of that as well as the supplement to help all 19 municipalities to make sure we've got the best paramedics fully staffed and ready to go in any part of Milwaukee County where you might hopefully never have, but if you ever have to have that experience to call 911, our folks will be ready to partner with the municipal fire departments. We keep the public safety intact. At the same time, we protect other quality of life components like our parks. In this budget, we had $38 million worth of investment to both remodel, repair, correct, and add to our parks assets, everything from new bathrooms, improved bathrooms, to new playground equipment, to new aquatic centers. You've heard a little bit of talk of late about the pool strategy. The interesting thing is, long before I got here, they did an aquatics master plan, and they showed what we've seen nationally, and it's not because of the budget. It's because of a national trend that we see fewer and fewer kids, and if you've got kids, like my kids are now in high school, but over the years watching, fewer and fewer kids go to traditional deep well pools, and instead they want aquatic centers, they want mini water parks, they want splash pads. This is where the trends are nationally, and so our budget reflects that. We put funding in there to finish off by the end of this fiscal year's budget an aquatic center in all 4 quadrants of Milwaukee County, and to replace in places where we've got tremendous drops in terms of attendance in traditional deep well pools, we put in place splash pads. If you look at the ones we put in, the irony is I get kicked around sometimes for closing pools, particularly on the north side. I've never closed a pool on the north side. My predecessor actually closed all the pools that are closed on the north side. I've only replaced, like Gordon Park and Madison Park and others, I put splash pads in there to take the place of pools that had previously been closed by my predecessor in the previous county board. But what we found is, in a place like Gordon or Madison, 2 good examples, communities love it better. Instead of having, you don't have to pay at a splash pad. If you got young kids, you don't have to worry because there's zero depth. They get all the fun of the water spraying around without the worry of saying, if you've got a 2 or 3 or 4 or 5-year-old, are they near the water? Are they going to jump in? Are they going to fall in? You don't worry because it all drains out. So it has a tremendous benefit. And the aquatic centers actually create enough of a revenue stream to offset the other costs that traditionally come with the aquatics program. So we'll see what the board does with that, but we think it's a positive. Similarly, you heard a lot of talk about privatizing the Milwaukee County Zoo. I want to be clear, that was the newspaper's headline. We indeed do want to do something different with the zoo. We have one of the best zoos in the world. We want to keep it world class for decades, if not generations to come, but we're not looking to sell it. And what we're looking to do is exactly what San Diego, arguably the best zoo in the world, San Diego does, Brookfield Zoo does in Chicago, almost all the other great zoos in the country do right now, and that is to create a nonprofit for the sole purpose of running the zoo. It would be taking the best of the county, which is the financial commitment long-term, both to the operating and to the capital asset, as well as the management of the animal collection there, of the wildlife collection, and merging that with the benefit of the current Zoological Society of Milwaukee, which is their strength is in fundraising, and it's in capital fundraising in particular, and in conservation and education, which they do exceptionally well, combining that into one. And so instead of having a zoo staff and a zoological staff that each has overhead, a director, management, HR, human marketing, even a separate admissions policy. That's one of the things that's always a challenge for us. Is you look at the zoo sells admission at the gate, the society sells admission year-round and a pass, and every time they sell another zoo pass, that's money that's taken away from the gate. It always seems to be somewhat of a contradictory, or at least competing interest. If you had one nonprofit running it, they would have a multifaceted admissions policy that was in the best interest of the zoo, not of one group versus the other. So we'll see where the board goes with it. We did it in two parts in this budget. In this part, the first phase in 2010, all we do is put a group together, and we put money in for legal representation to work out the specifics of making that sort of a transfer to a nonprofit. And then in 2010, it would require another vote before the transfer officially in October of 2011. Some of you think the world, was coming to an end, but that's really what we're proposing. And we think the more people learn, the more they see, the more they'll want this. Ironically, one of the biggest advocates for this is Chuck Wickenhauser, who for a couple decades now has been the director of the Milwaukee County Zoo and one of the award-winning zoo professionals in the world, who you'd think would have a vested interest not to do that, but who loves zoos, loves aquariums, sees that this is in the best interest of our zoo, and really is one of our strongest advocates for seeing this through. So we'll see if it happens. In other areas, in safety net programs, we maintain programs to support our older adults, whether it's community or senior centers, food programs, family care, which is the program that eliminated the waiting list for long-term care services. We do things for people with developmental and physical disabilities. In fact, we actually expand family care through this budget, adding $4.5 million of new tax levy to ensure that we're at a point where, while we once upon a time wiped out the waiting list for older adults for long-term care services, we can do the same thing for people under the age of 60 with developmental and physical disabilities. We do other programs are maintained for housing, supportive housing assistance for those suffering from mental illness, and we care and expand our services for our veterans in this community. So the basic safety net programs are intact. In transportation, even though originally the transit system proposed eliminating routes, we maintain whole routes in this budget. We don't cut any full route out. In fact, we actually add a component called bus rapid transit, which a couple of us were talking about before, which I think is pretty exciting. And even other places like Madison, other parts of the state, certainly others around the country, are looking to expand bus rapid transit. The idea being from the county grounds where the new school of engineering for UWM would be, past the institutions, the medical college, the hospitals, all that out there. We go down Wisconsin Avenue, all the way through downtown, up the Farwell Prospect corridor, up to the UWM campus, the main campus there. Bus rapid transit would be new, hybrid, longer length buses that look in many ways like our traditional rail system, have the amenities that come with that, lower cost operations because of the hybrid fuel efficiency, and probably most importantly, are in bus only or bus priority lanes with intersection control and other components that actually increase the amount of time, 30 to 35% better time response, which is usually the biggest deterrent that people who don't ride the bus today have, is it takes too long. You increase the time efficiency of riding the bus. You have these new buses that don't look like buses. They're three-quarters windows. I mean, there's all these other assets out there. We think this is going to be a great thing, and we're ready to move forward. And the beauty of it is to make this possible with our portion of that $91.5 million that has been sitting there for almost 2 decades. We can actually take the money we get from the land sale to UWM out on the county grounds, put that into a one-time use for a one-time match, so we're not creating another hole in the budget, and get this up and going next year, probably before the city of Milwaukee's even figured out how they're going to fund, or if they're going to fund, a streetcar system. So we're ready to go. We're moving forward. I would expect that's something that will be approved by the county board in this budget. The last couple components in quality of life, certainly you look at all that, you look at the transportation with the airport, the other assets that we have that really are not just transportation, they're business. They're the front door when it comes to transportation at the airport, the front door to the business travelers, and we make significant investments there. Then in the last points, the fourth and fifth points I mentioned at the beginning, in terms of a balance between public and private sector benefits, for us, it's just real simple. When 48% of our budget is wages and benefits, we cannot sustain county government the way it is unless we get a handle on wages and benefits. And so in this budget, we call for rather dramatic from a government standpoint, but I think compared to where all you are at with your own employees, your own workforces, probably fairly realistic changes in terms of what we expect from wages and benefits for employees. We have a slight reduction of 3% in the overall wage package, but where the biggest change is not just in dollars, but we go to asking our employees to make a 5% contribution, they don't make any right now, into the retirement system, and we ask our employees to contribute 15% for the cost of their health care. It's important to go from fixed dollar amounts to percentages, because the more we can get our employees to have skin in the game, particularly in health care, the better off we are. Now, I obviously would love to completely transform our health care package, but for what I can get through, we think this is fairly realistic. Now, the interesting part of it is if you look 5% on retirement's the national average. You look at 15%. Racine already asked for 15% from their county employees. The state goes from anywhere from 6 3/4 up to 16 3/4. We're not asking for a radical amount. This is not, like we're asking for 50-50. We're asking for 15%. Put this in perspective. The Kaiser Family Foundation about a month ago put out a report that showed that the average employee who pays for a family plan pays about $3,500 a year to cover that cost of the employee share, and the employer picks up a little over $9,000 for that. Now, that's the average plan out there. In Milwaukee County, the lowest cost HMO plan costs the employee, good thing you're all sitting, $840, and the employer, all of us, the taxpayers, on behalf of the county, picks up over $16,000. So I said, put this another way. Think about it. You all work hard, and you, on average, if you got a family plan you cover, you're paying on average $3,500, and then you go home and write a check out just for the county portion of your property tax bill to pay for another $16,000 per employee to cover health care. I said, I don't care whether you work at a union or non-union shop. Anybody outside of government looks at those numbers and says, this just doesn't make sense. It is not sustainable over time. It is exactly the same thing that has really driven Ford and GM and Chrysler into the ground. Unless we get a handle on it, there's just no way that county government, any level of government, can sustain itself with those sorts of legacy costs in place. And so that's really what we're asking for in this budget. And then the last component that goes with that, beyond just wage and benefit reform, we transform in this budget so that land sales either go for one-time purposes like the UWM land sale going to pay for a portion of the local match requirement for bus rapid transit, or it goes directly into buying down debt service payments. It's not going to go in to balance the budget. It's not going to go to pay for ongoing concerns. We reduce the sales tax projections, even though for years sales tax has always gone up statewide. I think it's the first time in 62 years sales tax collections are down from the year before. We adjust ours down considerably. We adjust down park revenues. We make other adjustments. because we say long term. There's got to be real reforms in to make sure that these are budgets that not only are balanced today, but they're budgets that lead to balanced budgets in the future. And so that's really the fundamental reform that we have in all of this. It really all goes together. The last thing I'll say, and then I think the timing's perfect to start taking questions, is if you read at least the story, and particularly if you've read the link and saw the report, I'm going to talk to the Public Policy Forum's Board of Directors tomorrow about this. But long term, they've identified, as they've looked at in the past, that unless you make these sorts of changes, there's just no way you can sustain county government, no matter how high you raise the property tax levy. I mean, under the current statutes, because of changes we made in debt restructuring a few years ago, the county board could, and I'm not saying that they are, because they haven't said anything close to this, but they could legally increase the tax levy by 28%. Now think about that. I mean, think about the exodus out the door, between concerns over sick leave and the school district and the cities and others. If we had a 28% increase in the property tax levy, I don't think you could slow traffic down fast enough for people who look to leave the county. Now, it's bad enough if you're even talking about 5, 6, 7%, but that would wipe out the $78 million or so, the gap that we started out with. They want to put everything back in, not make any of these reforms. But I even think I'm optimistic, having watched even the last 2 weeks, as much as they pound me. The reality is many, at least the key leaders on the county board, are even coming to the realization that there has to be some degree of change. Whether or not they're willing to go as far and aggressively as I'd like to go remains to be seen. But I think they understand that, again, it's just not sustainable. And that's essentially what this Public Policy Forum report put out. Rob Hankin, who's the president, once worked for me, but in fairness, the paper forgot to mention he was once the policy director for the county board, too. So he doesn't have, a dog in this fight, per se. He just realizes, having been there, having looked at it from the inside out, you just can't sustain this, and that's why these reforms are so critically important. I said again today to the board, if they want to change, 5% or 15%, if they want to flex that around, move that around a little bit, I'm not wed to that. I'm not saying, you got to pass exactly what we're talking about. But I do say two things. One, we can't pass a budget without fundamental long-term sustainable reform in it. So however you package it, it's got to have that long-term view. And two, it's got to be a balanced budget, not just for long-term, but for 2010, that's balanced without adding more to our tax burden here in Milwaukee County. If they can do those two things, again, however they get there, we're willing to negotiate on. But those two principles are ones that are guiding and ones that we're not willing to compromise on, while we are willing to compromise on the specifics. So with that, see if I can open up. Folks got questions.
Well, thank you, Scott.
Sure.
Anyone has questions over? And what I think we'll do is we'll repeat the question in deference to Wisconsin Eye audience, so that they can
I'll just
can hear along. Yep.
The 48% of the budget goes towards benefits and wages.
Mm-hmm.
How does that compare like 15 years ago, or let's say 10 years ago, or historically, how does it compare?
I don't know the exact percentage. There's been some growth, but historically, government in general is pretty high. If you look, for example, school districts are probably closer to 3/4. But that's because the state government, county government, city government have other things that they do that aren't so much personnel driven. For example, a good chunk of our budget in social services is money that already goes out to contract out for services with a Lutheran Social Services, a Goodwill Industries, other entities like that. But it's definitely grown. Frank, I don't know the exact percentage, but it has grown exponentially. And if you look at what we started out with a $90 million gap, we adjusted it down to $78 million before you even get started. That's just saying without any other changes, just to do what you do today, that's how much more it takes you. The biggest drivers in that were the wages and benefits increases that would be projected. You get other things, too, like the sales tax being down, investment earnings being down, all things driven by the economy, home sales, you name it. But wages and benefits are still, what we tried to do is say, since there's such a big driver, that's where we've got to have our reform.
I think in the private sector, I'd love to have these benefits.
Oh.
After the reform.
Well, and the other part to remember on that, when you have, we came in, I think it was about 80%. It's now around a little over 70, but that's our fringe benefit rate. I mean, think about that. I mean, even nationally, state and local government, on average, I think is about 32, 33% of the fringe rate. Most businesses, you all can think in your own mind, your fringe rate, if you're creeping above 30, you're in trouble. You're in real trouble. And yet, state government, I think, is about 44%. County government's, over 70. Unless you crack that nut, you can't sustain things. I can't tell you how much I commiserate with the CEO at GM or Chrysler, because I know in the end, and I even watch, what the federal government did in the bailout. All they did was defer the problem. I mean, they're not out of the woods yet by any stretch of the measure. They just deferred the problem in the future, because unless you deal with those legacy costs, it's just going to come back and bite you in the butt.
Scott, I'll jump in with.
Sure.
I see. Tom is here from the Gateway.
Yeah.
Maybe MMAC has for a long time had an interest in the airport and the governance of that, and we've made some unsuccessful runs at changing the governance structure away from the county board. What is your view on the governance of the airport, the opportunities we might have there on that asset?
Sure. Well, the airport overall, I think, is one of our most valuable assets. And the good news is, not just in this budget, but I think in general, this is one of the areas where the county board and I often are at odds on things, where there's great support, and I think pretty much universal support for the asset of the airport. I mean, it's why if you look in the last 6-7 years, while most airports across the country have seen stagnant or even in some cases declining passenger counts up until most recently, where obviously, even with today's economy, even Mitchell has slowed down a little bit. But for the last, I think, 6 years, every year we've broken the all-time passenger record. When I came, it was under 6 million. Last year, we were just 43,000 short of 8 million passengers. And I think that's for a variety of reasons. We made major commitments, whether it was in the parking structure, whether it's all the concourses being remodeled, whether it's the concessionary food mart, whether it's working with, even in the last couple of years with challenges with Midwest. The reality has been that we've been out seeking others. AirTran has had a tremendous growth. You're now seeing, I think, Republic is going to continue to make a commitment. Delta, having come out of Northwest, is still a major player in the market. And then beginning in a couple weeks, November 1st, Southwest Airlines, which clearly Southwest, looking at their business model, would not have come to Mitchell unless we have a world-class aggressive airport. For them, we have a great potential to draw off of northern Illinois, not just Lake and Forest County, but all the way over to Rockford. For people who normally would go down to Midway to fly, because that's where the Southwest hub is there, this is 10 times better. It's easier. It's more efficient. We've kept all the benefits to all of us who love the convenience of Mitchell International Airport. At the same time, we've added tremendous numbers of more passengers and value, too, whether it's Bartolotta's, whether it's the other restaurants and venues that we put in there. Long term, the AMMAC's talked about an authority. I've talked about alternatively the prospect of bidding out for the operations. And again, it's one of those when you hear privatization, sometimes people get it out of proportion. Right now, out of the thousands of people who work at the airport, a couple hundred are county employees. Everybody else, concessions is contracted out. The airlines run each of their different concourses, even to the point of housekeeping in some areas is run by this airline or that airline. There's a handful in the middle, and the management is run by the county. Long term, we have a tremendous asset that the FAA does not allow to take any of the benefit of it and apply it to anything else other than redirecting it back into the airport. And that's just the way it is. And a few years back, they created a pilot program for up to 5 airports. One was in a class all of its own. That's the one that you've heard the most about, Midway, down in Chicago, and Mayor Daley seeking to contract out operations of that. One is general aviation, but the other 3 are open to airports like ours. And the timing hasn't been the best, just because when Daley proposed it last year, I think the day his bids were due was September 24th, so you can remember what the market was like a year ago at that time. Prior to that, Daley had kind of set the table. Skyway Toll Bridge, I think he got $1.3 billion for. The parking structures in their park district, they got about $500 million for. They've done some other things like that down there. And for us, long term, we thought there was a way to bid that out. It takes 18 months to 24 months months, probably at a minimum, to do that. And that by bidding that out, you could take that, put a long-term revenue stream. And my argument had been you take one form of transportation that does exceedingly well at the airport, and you take a benefit of a stream of that, and you plug it into a permanent funding stream for mass transit through your bus system and your other related components to that. That's something that the board has to go along with. Right now, they're not real high on that, and obviously until the market improves a little bit, it's not going to be as apparent. My hope would have been that they'd still move forward on that, mainly because, again, if it takes 2 years, Lord help us if the economy isn't better in 2 years. It's not today's economy, today's marketplace that you look for. It's where it's going to be a year and a half, 2 years down the road, at least I think, if you got vision. And so we're going to still push for that. We didn't do that in this budget because we didn't want it to get bogged down in the budget process. But we're still going to pursue that because we think long-term that's the best route to go. The other part that ties into that, with the 440th space having come available, with everything else that's out there, and now with this new office, with our accelerated building, and with the new Office of Business Development, one of the things we hope to connect into that is to work not only with the association, but to work with the Milwaukee 7, the City of Milwaukee, and others to say, how can we take what is internally an incredible asset and spread that externally to create more excitement, more commerce, really, in that corridor related to the airport itself. Plenty of other places around the country really use that as an economic development wedge coming out of the airport, and I think we can do more with that. And this new office we'll be working with the association on, with the Gateway. Sure, to follow up on that.
Thanks. I was just going to ask you to talk about the office. Do you need approval from a county board to establish an office like that?
Yes.
As part of the budget approval?
Yes.
And
Yeah, it would take approval. Although the interesting thing is, the question was, does it take approval from the county board to approve that office? The answer is yes, although I think in this climate, while they may not like other things, this climate, both the office itself, the authority it has, and then the accelerated building program, I think it's almost too irresistible to not be out front doing things aggressively, both for parochial reasons and larger global reasons. Globally, obviously, when we got an unemployment rate in the city at 10%, when we got other challenges, when we got in the African American community amongst men in the city of Milwaukee, we got almost 50% unemployment. To me, anything that's going to, increase the opportunity for existing businesses to expand jobs and the potential of attracting other employers to this county, I think is almost irresistible, even for the board. They'll have to set aside the fact that I introduced it, because there's some who will just on principle vote against what I propose. But the other part is parochially, though, where I think and why we point out why we were so aggressive in this budget is my gap for 2009 in the county budget is largely driven by the economy as well. Sales tax collections are down. Investment earnings are down. Even things like the zoo and other revenue-generating sources are down because of the economy. It's in our best interest to have people in offices that do more to get the economy going here. So I think in the end they may change it. They may add a requirement that it has to be confirmed. The director has to be confirmed by the county board. I can live with that.
Is that a situation where you have to add staff to an office like that? And how many people do you have?
There'd be 4. There'd be a director and 3 others. They can shift spots around. That's probably what they'll end up wanting to do, making some adjustments as to where they go in. But again, in our case, is if you see, for just 4 positions, if you see, just adding 1% more in terms of helping employers add 1% more to the workforce would far exceed whatever cost there is involved with that. Sure, way back there.
The question, Scott, is the county now, or are you taking action to try and participate in the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act funding that's available for governmental entities?
Yeah, the area we have, and the criteria I mentioned early on, where I said, and it got all sorts of attributions as to what I said or didn't say. I said early on that I thought the taxpayers' money, the best use of a stimulus package at the federal level and at the state was to put money directly in the hands of people and employers to stimulate the economy. First at the federal level. I look back 30 years ago to when we had a malaise in this country, and the tax cuts that came into place fully enacted in '83 cut the marginal tax rate almost in half, created 21 million new jobs, 5 million new employers, created the largest peacetime economic boom in American history. I said, that's what you should do with it. Well, they didn't do that. So then they gave it to the states, to which I said, use $3.25 billion of that, 3.26 to be exact, and instead of using it to plug the state's budget hole, use it from March 1st through the end of the year to truly stimulate the economy by suspending the collection of the state sales tax. So not for a week, not for a month, but for 10 months, don't collect the sales tax in the state of Wisconsin. I said, can you imagine what that would do to stimulate the economy, not just in retail sales, on main streets and malls, but home building, automobile purchase, you name it. Anything out there, I thought that would really be stimulating. Didn't do that. So I listed in January a series of criteria to say we would accept funding through that federal act if it met the three criteria, which was no local match. You know, I want to get $50 million worth of funds, but I have to come up with $10 million I didn't have. So no local match, because often federal funding comes with local matches. No ongoing concern. And I referenced, for example, back in the Clinton era, President Clinton talked about 100,000 more cops on the street. The problem was that several years after, the funding went away, and the local municipalities were stuck with either funding the cops and increasing spending or cutting police officers, which wasn't good either. And the third component was no operating. Said I'm not going to use one-time funds that are going to be gone by the time my next budget comes up to balance the budget. And so we have included, not in the whole package, but included in portions of our accelerated building program and in portions of our budget, we have money from that very act that meets those three criteria. Whether it's bus purchases, we have about $25 million worth of funding from that act for new buses, low cost, not the hybrids from Bus Rapid Transit, but through more fuel-efficient, green buses that help us lower our operating costs as well as our maintenance costs. We have a significant amount of it that's in our road and infrastructure improvement, but they're all things that, again, meet that criteria. So we get the funds, but I don't get handcuffed into now funding things I can't afford a year from now. So we think it's a responsible use of those funding. Sure.
Somewhere along the way, I don't remember exactly when it was, but I heard some discussion, maybe it was a joke, about getting rid of the county board. That was after you became governor.
Yeah,
Is that serious?
actually, there is some seriousness. Well, there's two parts. One was the board itself was never talked about being eliminated. Chairman Holloway talked about eliminating the county executive and replacing it with an administrator. And that one you can attribute whatever you want in terms of the transparency of that one. But in a larger sense, and Jeff and I have talked about this over the years, long term, I think there's a legitimate question, particularly if this board sends a budget to me that fails to address any of these reforms, whether it's got tax increases or not, if they just push things off to firm into the future, I think there is a legitimate long-term question about in a county that is fully incorporated, the only county in the state that has no piece of land that's not an incorporated village or city, whether or not you truly need long-term a county government. And that can only happen if you have a governor and the legislature willing to act on that. And we've looked, the Greater Milwaukee Committee, some of you have heard about. I've talked with Shel Luber at length about this and met with him and others on it. But they've looked for the past year or so. They've been working with the Public Policy Forum. They've been working with the Wisconsin Policy Research Institute as to really see other places that have done things like this. It would be fairly unique because you've had some places, the most famous being Indianapolis and Marion County, but Nashville has a hybrid of that. Louisville, after 25 years, about 4 years ago, passed a referendum allows this. Others have metropolitan-like government or unigovernment, Dane County and Miami. This would not be a metropolitan government. Rather, it would be eliminating the county government in and of itself, and then taking things like the transportation components, the road aids that you get already from the state, giving them to each municipality. Taking things like the parks, the zoo, the other cultural attractions, and saying like they do in Chicago and Illinois or in the Twin Cities or in Oakland, creating an elected independent parks and cultural district that had a taxing authority but solely for the purpose of those institutions and wasn't drawn off by the county. Taking social services, which are largely funded through state and federal funds, plugging them right back to the state, which, while it's still too high, has a lower fringe benefit rate than the county does. And so for the same amount of money, you can actually get greater service than you currently have in county government, which we've argued for years. We argued for public assistance 5 years ago. You should take the income maintenance funds, give them back to the state, and you could actually get 24 more caseworkers to work on it than the county ever had. So there's always more efficient ways to do that. But I think if we haven't got to it, we're pretty close to a point where maybe everybody other than the county board thinks that's worth exploring.
One of the fears that I have is that, all of the cost savings that you brought and keeping Milwaukee County taxes as low as you possibly can, is the people at the city go, oh goody, there's more money for us to grab.
Well, that's always a challenge with the school district. I should repeat the question, sorry. Question is, I hold the line on taxes. If the city or somebody else say, great, I can grab that. It may have been that way in the past, but again, I don't know when. A lot of times people think I'm talking about holding the line on taxes because, there's somebody out in the suburbs who thinks that's important. And certainly I care about people who live in the suburbs. But increasingly, in a market like this, it's the retired couple who live in a duplex in Sherman Park that I worry about the most, because if they're on the edge of losing that duplex, they don't have a whole lot of margin, discretionary income, and suddenly now they get hit with 4 or 5% from the city, 4 or 5% from the county, 6-7% from the school district. At some point, there's going to be a tipping point where they can't afford to be there, or the young family who lives in the near south side, who just got a home, just started working, but hasn't had a wage increase in the last couple of years. How are they going to afford, with bills going up, with everything else going up, how are they going to afford, again, a 3 or 4 or 5% increase? And so certainly that's been a concern of mine, but I think the city, the school district, the technical school district, maybe not them so much because they're not elected, but the others that are elected have got to be feeling that same heat as well.
Question? I have another. Oh, there's one over there.
Earlier, when you were talking about the Milwaukee County Works Program and the Build America Bond, you made it sound like a no-brainer. My word, not yours.
Yeah.
But you also put the caveat on there that if the board passes that, again, to me it seemed like it was pretty much a win. Why wouldn't they?
I think they will. And I'm glad you asked that to have me. Again, I should repeat that. Build America bonds made it sound like you just point out it should be a no-brainer, but I agree with that question of would the board pass it. I think they will for that reason. What is the question mark is you also have to have then the discipline to stick with the program. What that means is we've accelerated capital projects that are already laid out in our long-term plan for 2010, 2011, 2012. What you don't want to do, and you can't do, or you screw things up, is then in 2010, next year, as you look to 11 and 12, decide, well, we did all these, now we want to do some more capital projects on top of that. You've got to have the discipline to say we had a program, we kept it in check. Now, I think we can, because years ago I did a debt restructuring plan that saved us millions of dollars at the time, and then I put in place a $30 million cap on our capital budget, cut about in half where our spending was before, and then I added an inflationary index on top of that. And by and large, the board last year creeped a little bit above that, but really not very much. Our worry all along was they just blow the lid off and ignore it. Even though it's not mandatory by the statutes, they still kept pretty firm to that. The main reason is because if you don't, you run the risk of your bond rating agencies taking note of that and negatively impacting your bond rating. As much as I have my differences with the board, they take, I think, as seriously as I do, the bond rating for Milwaukee County. And so I think that if they pass it the way we propose it, I think we can be fairly confident that they would keep that commitment all the way through 2012. But that's my only caution right now. The other caution, too, I didn't mention, but it's worth noting is, the pension, which we capped years ago when I came in so that there was no new benefit, new employees didn't get it. We capped off the backdrop and all the other problems that were out there, made some other changes in the pension board, did some other things. But you all may remember this past year, we had, in fact, I sat in federal court for a long time. Any of your attorneys I now have a greater appreciation for being in a courtroom because I sat at the front with our attorneys. We ended up getting a $45 million settlement from the actuarial firm who advised the county back in 2000. Now, that may not sound like a lot when you look at the unfunded liability, but it is the largest settlement in the country ever with an actuarial firm. So it was, it's not chicken feed. But the one cautionary I threw out when I gave my speech to the board, and it wasn't a lengthy one, probably was lost by most people in the media, but was a note to the board to say that money should stay in for the long-term unfunded liability of the fund. I don't think they're going to, but I am cautious to be ready to call it out if somebody did, that there is at least a potential that somebody on the board could say, well, let's take all that money and front load it. Since times are tough, since we've got this, and not just because of the pension benefits, but because the market fell apart, our pension contribution went way up because our earnings went way down like everybody else's. Let's use that money gained from the settlement all to balance the 2010 budget, to balance the pension contribution portion of that. To me, that would be bad because then that means the next year you'd have a humongous hole to fill in when there wasn't that settlement money. So I don't think you're going to, but I always like to be a little like Paul Revere and sound the warning to make sure nobody sneaks one in on us. Sure.
What might it take to stop the existing pension plan and go more towards the private sector, where most private companies have gone away from pension plans, and gone more towards 401ks or whatever it is?
Excellent question. Yeah, defined benefit, defined contribution. Yeah, from our standpoint, the question was, what would it take to change to a more traditional plan, at least amongst the free enterprise, free market side of things? For us in this budget, the reason we just went to a 5% contribution was just to get some buy-in there, because I brought it up in the past and it gets dismissed about as quick as it comes out of my mouth, unfortunately, mainly because members of the county board are also beneficiaries. But our point was, let's just stop it, pick a point, and say from this point forward, pension fund folks are over here, 401k is here. And again, it's one of those things where, like the percentage contribution, you can have a greater, you can control your costs in the future if you know this is how much we're going to put in, no matter how the market goes. No matter, you're not getting a defined benefit. The contribution is going to be fixed all the way through. That's tough, just because again they get the benefit, and probably more so than just the everyday citizen. The biggest constituency that most people on the county board, and this is just an observation, not an attack, but respond to, are public employees. Those are the folks who traditionally get them elected. That's the constituency they most frequently respond to. And so, whether it's the tax levy or whether it's things like this, that's where they're going to be inclined to be. The more educated people are, the more they raise that question to their county board supervisor, the more they question how you're going to be able to sustain it long term without that kind of a change. At some point, we're going to get to a point where we can change that, but it's going to take a while.
How many public employees are there in the county?
There's under 6,000 now. When I came, there was well over. In fact, since 2002, when I came, our debt's down 10%. Our workforce is down about 23%, largely either through attrition or through contracting out for services. I figure I still want to provide the services, particularly in social services, but if I can go to a Goodwill, and when they talk about privatization, it's usually contracting out with community-based organizations, but I get people who pay the same or similar amounts to what the county pays, but just don't have the legacy costs looming out there. I can get greater value for the same dollar, but we've gradually reduced that because that was our way of getting around those legacy costs. And actually last year, with tightening up on that, we were, I think, one of the few in the country that ended up with a slight surplus. It's tough. You got to work hard at it, but we had about a $4.1 million surplus, even though the state and others had huge deficits.
And the fiscal year is June 30th?
No, ours the state runs runs July 1st to June 30th. The county's on a calendar year, but the fiscal year's a calendar year.
Forecast for this year?
Well, we're still tight, and we'll be tight through the end of the year. It's why I talked about a 35-hour work week. The county board thankfully took note. I was worried they'd put their head in the sand, but took note, and they've signed off on, or they're going to approve a furlough plan through the end of the year. Again, it's not what my preference was. I think it's easier to manage a 35-hour work week, but I'll take it. I'd rather have that than have them ignoring the reality of what's going on. With our goal being that at the end we'll finish, in a balanced budget. Sure. One last question.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on the Estabrook Park Dam?
Mm-hmm. The question was, what are the thoughts about the Estabrook Park Dam? In our case, the DNR gave us a pretty specific order about maybe a month and a half ago about actions that need to be made. We put money in this budget, in the capital budget, to comply with the first few phases. The biggest one, I think the second one down after keeping it clear, is that we have to put money in it has to be completed, I think, by next October, I get the date right, September, October, but an engineering report as to the feasibility of either stabilizing the dam or taking it down. We said that we got to comply with that first. That would give us a better understanding of not only the feasibility of doing that, but the true cost, because there have been some who want the dam up, stay up, and just be fixed. We're concerned that the original estimates that the Department of Transportation and Public Works gave were too high. This would be an external engineering firm that would look at that, would look at both the stabilization and then give some ideas as to what the true costs are. And then that would give the county board the ability to set a policy as whether it stays up or it stays down. The DNR has been a little bit contradictory in that, with one part of the county government, they suggest that they want us to stabilize it. With another area, they suggest that they want it down. And they've had somewhat, like I said, competing or conflicting views. For us, having a written order with multiple stages allows us to comply with that. And hopefully, we'll get that passed in the budget. They'll establish a policy as part of that through the county board's review of it. And then by next year, we'll have that study back, and then we can put the full amount in, whether it's to keep it up, which is certainly a strong sentiment in the Glendale area, or if the DNR were to order us to take it down, we'd at least know one way or the other.
Great. Well, let's thank the county executive again. I know Scott has to go off to a TV interview, so he's going to have to make a pretty quick exit. But I want to thank him again. I want to thank all of you for coming, and thank our series sponsors from Potawatomi Bingo Casino and the Business Journal serving Milwaukee for their help on this, too. So thanks. Have a great evening.